Welcome. My name is Charles Stang. I'm the director here at the Center, and this is our fourth faculty book event of the year. This popular series was established by my predecessor, Frank Clooney, as an opportunity for the HDS community and the wider Harvard community, and indeed wider communities than that, to gather not only to celebrate faculty publications, but more importantly to engage them both appreciatively and critically. And to that end, we're grateful for our two respondents whose comments will kick off what I'm sure will be a very spirited conversation. Before we begin, however, let me remind you to please silence your cell phones. So before I introduce our two respondents, let me briefly introduce our author and colleague. And I should say that I favor brief introductions so that our time together is spent learning from these three scholars, not learning about them. At the center of this evening's event is our very own Dan McKanan, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Unitarian Universalist Association Senior Lecturer in Divinity. Dan studies religious and spiritual movements for social transformation in the United States and beyond, with particular emphasis on environmental activism, intentional communities, and socialism. He's the author of 5 books, most recently, of course, Eco-Alchemy, Anthroposophy and the History and Future of Environmentalism, which we'll be discussing tonight, and in 2011, Prophetic Encounters, Religion and the American Radical Tradition, which won the Frederick G. Melcher Book Award. I hope I said that right. Our first respondent is Professor Rebecca Kneale Gould from Middlebury College. She is a scholar, writer, and environmental advocate. She served for 8 years as a tenured associate professor of religion at Middlebury and now holds the position of associate professor in environmental studies. Her book on spirituality and back to the land practices, entitled At Home in Nature, was published by the University of California Press in 2005. She has spoken and published widely on the connection between religious identity and environmental advocacy. Our second respondent is our very own Terry Tempest Williams, the HDS writer-in-residence for the 2017-18 academic year, and who, along with her husband Brooke, is a resident here at the CSWR. Terry is an author, conservationist, and activist. Her writing is rooted in the American West and has been significantly influenced by the arid landscape of her native Utah and its Mormon culture. She is the author of numerous books, including the environmental literature classic, Refuge, which a number of us actually read and discussed just the other week. And her most recent book is The Hour of Land, a personal topography of America's national parks, which was published in June 2016 to coincide with and honor the centennial of the National Park Service, which of course is under threat. So here's how this evening will unfold. Dan will say a few words about his book. Then Rebecca and Terry will respond in turn. Then we'll give Dan a chance to respond. And then we'll open it up to discussion for your questions and comments. And we'll invite all three of them to move their seats up here to face you to facilitate discussion. So please join me in welcoming our colleague Dan McKanan for his introduction to his book, Eco-Alchemy.
Thank you so much, Charlie, for your kind introduction, and thank you, Terry and Becky, for the words you will contribute, and thanks to the staff here at the Center for your ongoing work in sustaining this really wonderful series to help all of us on the faculty share our new work with the Divinity School community. I'm going to pass a copy of the book around because I don't think another one is going around yet. So Eco-Alchemy is a study of environmental activism inspired by the anthroposophical movement, which is to say inspired by the spiritual teachings of an early 20th century fellow named Rudolf Steiner and various groups of people working in his tradition. And I want to begin by offering a blanket dispensation to anyone who struggles to say the word anthroposophy. And as I take it, my task is just to tell you a little bit about how I came to write this book and the methods I used, and then hear from our respondents. So the seed of this book actually was planted in the summer of 1994 when I was a doctoral student at the University of Chicago working with Catherine Breckes, and picked up our local alternative paper, the Chicago Reader, and found an article about this brand new concept for me, community-supported agriculture. This is the system where people purchase a share of the produce of a farm and take on some of the risk of the operation of the farm. If carrots grow well that summer and broccoli doesn't grow so well, you get a lot of carrots and not much broccoli. So it moves a little bit away from a kind of market-based consumerist way of doing agriculture. And this article told me that there were 3 farms that were serving the Chicago area that summer. And 2 of those 3 farms were part of a school of agriculture that I'd never heard of, biodynamics. This is the anthroposophical version of organic agriculture, and it predates every other organized international movement promoting organic agriculture. And I wound up signing up for a share at Angelic Organics, which is a farm run by a great guy named John Peterson, also known as Farmer John. If you track down the movie The Real Dirt on Farmer John, you can learn a lot about his personal journey to doing biodynamic agriculture. And I believe that Professor Charlie Hallisey was a consultant on that film as well. So another connection. Farmer John had a great newsletter, and I learned all kinds of fascinating esoteric things about agriculture, how you can think of a plant as an upside-down human being with a root system that corresponds to the mental system of the human being, and everything else kind of in reverse. I thought, hadn't ever thought about something like this. And it just kind of planted itself in the back of my mind. 5 years later, I was teaching at St. John's and St. Ben's in Minnesota, interested in beginning a new book project on intentional community, and discovered a community in my neighborhood called Campbell Village, Minnesota, one of about 100 communities worldwide where people with and without intellectual disabilities engage in agricultural life together, again, inspired by anthroposophy. And I started spending a month each summer with the folks at Campbell Village, Minnesota. And I saw a lot of stuff that really appealed to my environmental sensibilities at Campbell, Minnesota. People producing lots of healthy organic food, people really caring for their animals. The farmer talked to me about how her number 1 obligation was to the health of her land, and her number 2 obligation was to the health of the cows that lived on that land, and the people who might eat products from those cows came after that. Very, very appealing environmental vision, but also a lot of stuff that was quite different from what I had learned in my course on religion and ecology at Vanderbilt Divinity School. One of the things I learned in that course was that if you want to have a religion that really cares for the natural world, it needs to be a religion that is this worldly. My professor, Sally McFaig, said, if you want to care for this world, you really have to believe this is the only world we have. And here I was at Campbell Village, Minnesota, in a group of people who were caring deeply for this planet and also reading a book by Rudolf Steiner called How to Know Higher Worlds. And I realized there was something about my own imagination of what an ecological spirituality might look like that didn't match up with what people were actually doing in the world. And I said, I've got to kind of unearth this conundrum and really understand how you can have a spiritual tradition that holds certain principles that can seem really weird to a secular or even a liberal Christian environmentalist in terms of otherworldly spiritualities, but also be deeply engaged in care for this earth. Since Charlie Stain is our host, I will also say that another thing that puzzled me that summer was that Rudolf Steiner makes a great deal of what happened at the Eighth Ecumenical Council, and I learned in my University of Chicago church history class that there were only 7 ecumenical councils. And those of you who were in my class this fall might have noticed at our visit to Camp Hill Village, USA, that I was continuing that conversation begun in the summer of 1999 about the Eighth Ecumenical Council. And I actually have figured it all out, and you can look on page 273 for the footnote that explains why both Professor Bernie McGinn at the University of Chicago and Rudolf Steiner have something worthwhile to say about the ecumenical councils. Okay, so I put that question on the back burner for about 20 years and picked it up again in 2013 when the Center for the Study of World Religions gave me a sabbatical, gave me some funding for the travel that began on my year-long sabbatical. And I was able to use my connections with the Camp Hill movement as a springboard to engage in biodynamic farms and other anthroposophical banks and other initiatives, putting Steiner's ideas about care for the world into practice in the world. And on the travels that I did that summer and the ethnographic immersion and interviews that I did on those travels were the starting point for the book. People told me things. They said, hey, there's a connection between biodynamics and Rachel Carson. You need to figure that out. And then I started doing the historical research to show all the places where activities inspired by Steiner intersected with more mainstream forms of environmentalism over the past century. And in addition to the ethnographic and the historical dimensions of the book, I was given great freedom by the University of California Press to also incorporate a more normative kind of philosophical approach and really wrestle with that conundrum that had brought me to the topic in the first place, of how do you find common ground between this spiritual tradition and mainstream environmentalism. So I devoted a chapter to trying to address some of the standard criticisms that some people have made of anthroposophy, criticisms that it's unscientific, that it's politically conservative, that it is anthropocentric, as the name might suggest, and that it is sectarian. Tried to reframe all of those criticisms, but still take them seriously. And then I concluded with a chapter on what I see as some of the most important things that mainstream environmentalists can learn from the anthroposophical movement, even if we may not fully embrace it as an all-encompassing spiritual orientation. That, I think, is all the time I have. So if you have questions about what I've just said, there'll be chances for that, but now we'll hear from Rebecca and from Terry.
I'm going to fill in a little bit of some of what you hinted at. Thank you, Dan. It's been interesting watching people file in. I've got a former student in the audience, former teachers in the audience, people I didn't expect. Hi, Catherine. And so it really is a privilege to be here. I spent portions of my undergraduate life, well, all of my undergraduate life, but only portions of it in this building long ago, and as a graduate student, but it's been years since I've been back, so it was really quite freaky to walk over into Andover Hall and feel the vibe good, and remembering the nerve-wracking moments as well. So Because our time is limited, and it always bothers me when people go on for too long, I am going to read these comments so I can pack in a fair amount fairly quickly, and I will probably cut myself off a little bit before I'm even done. I hope you can bear with me about that. I'm just trying to move around all these cords here. Okay. So what I want to start with is a little story, because as I thought about how I wanted to assess Dan's book, I found myself asking a question that, and Catherine, you can correct me if I'm wrong about this, but does the American Religious History Colloquium still meet on Monday nights? Tuesday nights. Okay, thank you. It was always, well, that was the biggest problem I had writing these remarks, was it Monday or Tuesday? Anyway, which shows how good Dan's book is, that I did not have to worry about some other things. So back then, when I was here as a graduate student, we would meet over in the Braun Room, alternate Tuesday nights, and senior professors and first-year graduate students together would be presenting their work in progress, and then we'd spend the rest of the evening dissecting or sometimes vivisecting the papers that had been presented. And at that time, John McGreevy, who's an historian of American Catholicism, was there as part of our colloquium. He's now at Notre Dame. And on a regular basis, he would lean back and in his chair and remark, "This is all very interesting, but what larger story does your seminar paper point to?" And this became known as the McGreevy question. And woe unto him or her who did not anticipate that question before walking into the Braun Room. What's so wonderful about Eco-Alchemy is the extent to which it is carefully structured to probe and address the McGreevy question, whether or not the author knew that was the question he was addressing. And what I mean by that is how thoroughly and compellingly Dan educates us about Rudolf Steiner, anthroposophy, and biodynamic agriculture, and of course much, much more. And the book's primary arguments are all about the larger environmental stories to which his research points. Anthroposophy contributes to some of these larger environmental stories, sometimes departs from them, and always continually engages them. So the bulk of the response that I want to offer this evening is my own take on the McGreevy question. And what I want to do is just enumerate and introduce a few of the larger stories that came to mind to me as I pondered McKanan's book. And my hope in doing all this is to spark conversation among us and among all of us here, because that's what it's really all about. That's what we're here for. Because I write and teach in the environmental humanities, the thinking that I'm offering here will be largely in that realm of larger stories. It will be a little bit nerdy at times, but I hope fun for academics and non-academics alike to engage with. But first, I just want to say a word of direct appreciation for Eco-Alchemy as a whole. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and not only because the topic is so appealing and the author is a friend and colleague, true confessions here, that's all true. But what McKanan's book really distinguished itself in a couple of different ways, and I just want to mention a few of those before I get into these larger stories. One thing that I really liked that you commented on, Dan, is the methodological diversity in the book. It's part historical, it's part ethnographic. I have a bias about that since that was how I wrote my own book on back to land movements. And then, as you just mentioned just now, it's also normative and philosophical. It goes in many directions. And I've seen that done not so well, and McKanan's book does it very, very well indeed. More important to my mind is the extent to which Eco-Alchemy is an inquiry in the true intellectual sense. McKanan's book has clear arguments, of course. I'm going to fill out a couple of them, not summarizing the book, but just a few things that struck me that were direct historical arguments that he alluded to earlier. Part of that is really looking at anthroposophy's direct and indirect role in the evolution and shape of environmentalism in the West, primarily England, Germany, Scandinavia, and the US, with a sort of primary US lean. In it, we learn about fascinating and largely, I think before now, unrecognized lines of influence. One is anthroposophy's role in giving birth to community-supported agriculture initiatives that he just mentioned. And today, we feel the metaphorical and literal fruits of that. Dan really uncovers the early history of that. Another fascinating story, really fascinating because I didn't know it, is how anthroposophy and biodynamics shaped Marjorie Spock's and Polly Richards' concerns and lawsuits about the formidable ecological effects of DDT. Richards and Spock, McKanan tells us, collected thousands of pages of testimony that they funneled to Rachel Carson, who in turn drew heavily on this material in crafting Silent Spring. Those are just two examples of the sort of more historical story that McKanan conducts in the book. But these more direct arguments, which are a mix of intellectual and cultural history, are just the start. What I find even more compelling is the way that Dan takes us past the history itself and into the realm of complex analysis, as he does in the last two chapters when he probes the boundaries and limits of anthroposophy as well as its gifts. Here, to my mind, is where Eco-Alchemy really takes off, becomes very analytically rich. McKanan weaves his way carefully through difficult questions, such as whether and how anthroposophy was tied up in the fascist dimensions of early ecological movements in Germany, or in what ways Gaian biocentrism both reflects and departs from Steiner's sense of the earth as a living being. And I'm glad you mentioned McFaig, because she came to mind often when I was reading your book. So I naturally gravitate towards scholars who are well-versed but don't claim to know it all in the realm of analysis. Dan knows a lot, but I'm talking about his generosity of spirit, not how much he knows. So rather, these kinds of authors draw readers into their thinking, asking searching questions, proposing ways to wrestle with these questions, but they leave some of the wrestling for the readers themselves to do. Obviously, we all come to a book with different experiences, backgrounds, and expectations, as I think we'll just see in the discussion later, and a good author writes with attentiveness to that reality. McKanan invites his readers into his thinking in just this careful and artful way, and I loved watching him do it. So with all of those bows of appreciation in mind, I now want to unfold some of these larger stories that I think the book points to. And to be clear, I'm not saying that McKanan's book neglects these larger stories, but rather points at them. And what I want to do is just flesh out these larger stories, suggesting directions in which the environmental humanities needs to develop, but you don't have to be in the humanities, environmental humanities, to see how important these stories are. So there are four I'm going to touch on briefly, probably only really getting into three and marking the fourth for later. One is thinking about American environmentalism in more transatlantic terms. Two, paying attention to agriculture as central to environmentalism, and in so doing, continuing to raise questions about the elitist and potentially racist dimensions of idealizing wilderness preservation as the paradigmatic environmentalist cause. Three, particularly interesting, putting disability into the story of American environmentalism, and by extension, bringing disability studies into the environmental humanities. And four, making the study of religious environmentalism more nuanced, and that was something Dan was just getting into toward the end of his remarks. So, transatlantic influences. This one I will touch on the most briefly, because it's the most straightforward. Environmental studies scholars who are also Americanists tend to ignore transatlantic influences. And perhaps it's that intractable problem of American exceptionalism, which unfortunately we're experiencing a revival of at this particular political moment. Perhaps it's that exceptionalism that allows us to continue to tell environmentalist history as if it came out of nowhere with Silent Spring and Earth Day. We know now that Silent Spring did not come out of nowhere, nor did Earth Day. So for those of us who want to dig further down into the roots, which Dan and I are both committed to doing, we need only to look at New England transcendentalism to see how thoroughly European this American religious and intellectual movement was. McKanan's book turns our attention to other aspects of transatlantic influence that are certainly not isolated from European Romanticism, but tell a different kind of story through Steiner and the legacies of Steiner's work. And not surprisingly, perhaps Goethe is the omnipresent intellectual tie that binds here. He profoundly shaped the thinking of Emerson, Thoreau, and Fuller, and obviously Steiner in different but overlapping ways. So there's the transatlantic part. Agriculture. Despite the current proliferation of farmers markets, organic food establishments, and local food, both the food itself and vociferous debates about local, agriculture in American environmentalist discourse, and I'm stressing that because it's not so much the case in other places, has always been something of a bad boy. Some of agriculture's bad rap has come reasonably enough from concerns about industrial agriculture, and these concerns reach back into the stories that McKanan tells us of Steiner's Ehrenfried Pfeiffer's and Eva Balfour's insistence on biodynamics as a response to the evils of emerging industrial agriculture. They're responding in particular to the atomization and mechanization of the art of farming that they understood to be essentially a spiritual practice in and with a living earth. Today, of course, we can add to this list of things that they were responding against in our own time. We can add extensive and tragic monocropping, climate impacts, climate injustice, and animal cruelty to that list. So within environmentalist politics and scholarly discussions, however, as much as we see a critique of industrial agriculture in our own time as well as in the time that Dan is writing about, within academic discussion, maybe this says bad things about academics, agriculture has been more neglected. It's been suspect for broad conceptual reasons. For agriculture, by definition, involves significant human impact on the land. And by contrast, some, although not all, deep ecologists, bioregionalists, and wilderness preservationists, for them, the environment to which environmentalism often refers is nature without humans anywhere on the scene, or at least not visibly so. In the 1990s, environmental historian William Cronin, in his influential article, The Trouble with Wilderness, and Richard White in his Are You an Environmentalist or Do You Work for a Living? Great title. Both these writers sought to dismantle the false nature only ever equals wilderness equation. They did so not because they did not love and value wilderness, they did, but because they wanted to raise deep questions about elitism, racism, and general narrowness of vision that emerges when we dig into the assumptions that lie beneath the American reverence for wilderness. This included, by the way, some of you know the story and some of you may not, preservationists who were keeping wilderness wild by forcing native peoples out of their homelands in order to create national parks. I'm glad some of you are nodding, but I've spoken about this in some audiences, and they're like, oh my God, really? They're very surprised. And I was too when I first heard these stories. So as effective as this critique of wilderness was within some academic circles, it has had trouble taking hold. And this reluctance to respond has been even more the case in American political and activist circles, where attention to food and agriculture has been prominent, and McKanan mentions this in his book, is in the realm of religiously based environmental activism, where much of my research is located. In religious environmentalism, social justice, liturgical reform, theological innovation, and food and farming, are you listening, Lindsay? She wrote a lot about that, are all intertwined. But as McKanan rightly notes, and I'm quoting from his book here in the introductory section, in seeking to connect ancient wisdom to contemporary concerns, some of these people have bypassed the first half of the 20th century, tracing the roots of organics no further back than the spiritual poetry of Wendell Berry in the 1970s. I share McKanan's commitment to reach further back into the 19th and 20th century to really understand the cultural, political, and intellectual forerunners of contemporary ecological and or eco-spiritual agriculture. Indeed, a growing number of us have tried to locate agriculture into environmental studies where it rightly belongs, which is near the center, at the very nexus of the human nature, and some would add human nature spirit, in a kind of triangle relationship. McKanan's book makes a significant and articulate contribution to this discussion. He lays it right out in his introduction and develops it throughout. And his work will, I suspect, generate future work where ecological agriculture of various kinds takes center stage. And again, I'm not casting aspersions on wilderness. I love to go there. But this conversation is complex and needs to be moved in another direction. And Dan, you do such a good job of doing that. Here's my third larger story, and I'm going to just name the fourth but not get into it, so I can turn it over to Terry. The third is bringing disability into the environmental conversation and disability studies more intentionally into the environmental humanities. And here I want to tell a little story about how I first met Dan, which is via the what I would call the intellectual matchmaking of Robert McDermott, a leading Steiner scholar who published the edited volume American Philosophy and Rudolf Steiner. Dan wrote the introduction to that book, beautifully written introduction, and I had a chapter on Thoreau and Steiner in it. So I met Dan on paper through this project, and then in person when a group of like-minded scholars gathered in Northern California for a workshop on contemplative environmental studies, which would also be yet another larger story. Dan and I went for a hike. I don't know if you remember this, Dan. Good. I'm glad you do. And during that hike, Dan regaled me with stories about the Camp Hill movement, which was completely unknown to me. I found myself to be utterly captivated by these communities, which, as Dan puts it, seek, again I'm quoting from his book, to honor the human dignity of persons with and without disabilities. And the order there, I think, is important. It became clear to me in conversation, and much more so from reading Eco-Alchemy, that the Camp Hill network is a natural extension of other anthroposophical commitments to balancing polarities, humans in nature, matter, and spirit, and so on. I believe, if I read you correctly, that is coming out of that broader framework, and possibly some other things as well. In environmentalism, more broadly, however, in the realms of both activism and scholarship, persons with disabilities have been largely excluded, either intentionally or by omission. This exclusion, if you're thinking it through the way I've been trying to, goes hand in hand conceptually with the aforementioned wilderness problem. If the only real nature is wilderness, who has access to that wilderness? If the authentic environmentalists are mountain climbers rather than farmers or eco-villagers, who is privileged and normalized here, and who is denied entry? While conversations in the environmental humanities are increasingly attentive to the ways that race, class, and gender shape our ideas of nature, and that's where a lot of my teaching, I try to do that, they have only recently brought disability into the discussion. Sarah Jacket Ray's book, The Ecological Other, is one example of a book that has moved us in the right direction, particularly a chapter called Maimed Away from Mother Earth, the Disabled Body in Environmental Thought and Literature. Among other things, Ray describes how the risk culture that is promoted by wilderness-seeking hikers, rock climbers, and extreme skiers impacts those who do not fit the able-bodied and often white and wealthy mountaineer profile. In Ray's analysis, disabled persons are either excluded from wilderness-oriented adventure culture, or if they manage to partake in this culture, they are lionized as exceptional in ways that may be well-intentioned but are often demeaning. Again, the implication underneath all of this is that wilderness is real nature, and mountaineers and, say, risk-taking Greenpeace activists or kayaktivists are the real environmentalists. So the ecological other is excellent in probing the insidious and persistent problem of the excluded other in ecological discourse, but Sarah Ray's analysis is intentionally focused on why such othering happens and on who benefits from these practices. So the problem. McKanan's book, while not focusing primarily on disability, makes an absolutely wonderful contribution to the nexus of environmental studies and disability studies by bringing forward positive examples of how the problem of othering and the trouble with wilderness are both dismantled in holistic ways by initiatives such as the Camp Hill movement. So one of my very few gentle criticisms of McKanan's book, in fact, is that I wish he had lingered more on the Camp Hill examples and then readdressed their promise with respect to the strengths and weaknesses in contemporary environmentalism and environmental studies scholarship. Or to put it another way, McKanan might have made more of his own contributions to a long-neglected topic in environmental humanities, but he's a humble sort and maybe didn't pause to do that. So with that, so we can move on to hear from Terry, I want to end with just two little notes of where we might take the discussion further. One is getting back to this question of religious environmentalism and where Steiner and anthroposophy fit in. My first book was on back to the land movements and sort of nature spirituality that was far away from recognizable religion, and then later work has been on eco-Judaism, Christian ecological thought, and so on. And Steiner and anthroposophy fit somewhere interesting in between those. I think his comments on anthropocentrism and working his way through that are also worthy of discussion. And finally, I think there's something to be learned, perhaps particularly in this political moment, about striving to balance polarities and the value of pursuing a third way through the challenges before us. So thank you, Dan, for your wonderful book, and thank you in advance, Terry, for the insights I know you will offer and the discussion to follow.
Thank you, Becky, for your provocative and evocative analysis. Dean Hempton, Charlie, dear CSW community and HDS community and guests, It's a pleasure and privilege to be able to respond, Dan, to your provocative book, Eco-Alchemy, Anthroposophy, and the History and Future of Environmentalism. A joy, truly. Dan, you've been a great colleague from the minute we met last summer in anticipation of the Thoreau bicentennial. And I remember the long, rich conversation that we had outside the patio, on the patio outside Andover Hall. And I remember thinking, I have a lot to catch up with everything that you know and embody. So it was humbling, realizing the depth and breadth of your knowledge and experience, and it's certainly evident in Eco-Alchemy. I also realized that I met a kindred spirit, and I feel that even more so now. The first paragraph of this book is one that I have since typed and put on my desk. Quote, "Today's environmental movement is a vast ecosystem that includes farmers and teachers, monkey-wrenching activists and pragmatic politicians, pagans and I almost said prostitutes, pagans and Protestants, toddlers playing on the beach and elders planning a green burial. All are united by an awareness that their individual destinies are cut up with the health of natural systems at the local, global, and cosmic level." You go on to say, human beings have always evolved in symbiosis with wheat and cattle and intestinal bacteria. Environmentalists are human beings who are becoming conscious of our interdependence. The consciousness is changing what we eat, how we treat plants and animals, where we live, and how we travel. Environmental consciousness is also changing our culture, the stories we tell, the ways we teach and learn, our outer rituals and innermost beliefs. It's truly one of the most powerful credos I've read, and I literally have it above my desk, and to me, it truly marks that we have become more inclusive, comprehensive of this moment that we face in the Anthropocene, and how we as human beings can now orient ourselves in this beautiful, broken world. On so many levels, Eco-Alchemy has been revelatory to me, as Becky has convincingly and powerfully expressed in the field of environmental humanities. Dan then goes on to create a map for his readers, citing Anthroposophy's contributions to the environmental movement. Biodynamic agriculture, a spiritual and alchemical form of farming that paved the way to organic farming, the movement we know in the 20th century. And he's also arguing for, quote unquote, the centrality of agriculture, challenging, quote, the assumption that concern for wild nature is what defines environmentalism, unquote. It's here that I personally found a tender point as a reader. I belong to the preservation, the protective side, or protectionary side of the binary that Dan McKanan argues against. And you heard Becky talk about that. So if you hear an emotional response in my voice, it is there. My bias is revealed. I come from a lineage of environmentalists, the very ones that he critiques. And it's true, I'm not so enamored with wheat. Despite my gluten-free allergy, or my free allergy. Wilderness is my refuge. I'm grateful, Dan, that you offered up an anecdote to set up your argument. He tells the story of Steve Kafka, director of California Biomass Collaborative at UC Davis, how he tells the story of this time at Alan Chadwick's garden in Santa Cruz. Quote, he was giving a tour of Alan Chadwick's garden to the Sierra Club president, David Brower. Full disclosure, David Brower was a mentor of mine and dear friend. Kafka began, quote, the garden at one time looked just like this chaparral-covered hillside. Now look how wonderful it is. And Brower muttered, the chaparral-covered hillside looks just fine to me. Dan writes, for Kafka, this was evidence of a basic divergence between preservationists and those who, like Chadwick, saw nature as, quote, a place to transform and create, unquote. So, Dan, you give me permission to offer another anecdote from the other side. And I should say that those of us in the American West, we don't refer to ourselves as preservationists. That's what canning is for. But we do see ourselves as defenders of that which is under siege, conservationists, conserving what radical forces are trying to undo. So here's my story. It begins at a dinner party in Emigration Canyon, just on the edge of Salt Lake City, where Brigham Young, leader of one of the it gets so complicated, right? Brigham Young, when he stood over the Salt Lake Valley and said, "This is the place. This is where we were having dinner." It was at the home of Dennis Sizemore, who is a grizzly bear biologist of some renown and founder of Round River Conservation, who partnered with several First Nations, Tlingit and Haida among them, in British Columbia, and together protected with the Canadian government over 10 million acres. The distinguished botanist and MacArthur Fellow, Wes Jackson, founder of the Land Trust, or the Land Institute in Kansas, which describes its main goal as the development of natural systems agriculture, was in town. And he is beloved, and he's a dear friend. And he was a special guest around the table with some dirtbag environmentalists, myself included. After a celebratory discussion about the reintroduction of wolves in Yellowstone, it must have been around 1995, Wes kept saying, what is it with you Westerners? Don't you know it's all about grasses, grasses, grasses? And he waxed rhapsodic about the prairie. Seated across from Jackson was Barry Gilbert, who is also a grizzly bear biologist who teaches at Utah State University. We've all grown up with Barry, and his black patch over his eye really was just like a pair of glasses to us. We knew the story behind it. And in a lull in the conversation, Wes Jackson said, what's your patch? And we all sort of just looked down, and to our great surprise, Barry pulled off his patch, and there was his hollowed out eye with a huge scar and his sunken cheekbone. And he said, "Grizzly bear." To all of our amusement, then Wes Jackson, he took Wes's hand and placed it in the back of his head, and his fingers sunk into the back of his skull. And we saw Wes Jackson turn white, and then he said, "You guys are crazier than I even knew." And then it was at that point that Dennis Sizemore said, "Grizzlies, grizzlies, grizzlies." At least that's how I remember it. Historically, it's my feeling that this kind of binary, agriculture versus wilderness, grasses versus grizzlies, belongs to 2 decades ago, when you originally said that's when the seedbed of this book was planted. That binary was real. I don't think it was productive in terms of personal relationships. I think it was extremely fruitful and productive in terms of how we proceeded. So I think you're right to actually start there. We know that in the 1970s it was the Back to the Landers by Helen, inspired by Helen and Scott Nearing and their contribution, the Common Ground Fair in Maine, Maine Organic Farmers Gardeners Association. So many of this started in that time here. The Bread and Puppet Theater, Wendell Berry is an eloquent voice for agriculture. In the American West, we had Edward Abbey, who wrote Desert Solitary, the Radical Environmentalist Bible, and the Formation of Earth First, Eco-Terrorism. Dave Foreman, the founder, who was later taken into custody by the FBI. These were really hot and heated times in the American West, and Abbey was the guru, much in the same way that Wendell Berry was in terms of writers. The monkey wrench was our form of creativity, and we raised it high. We had the timber wars in the Pacific Northwest. We had the wilderness wars in the interior West, particularly in Utah, and we had the wolf wars in the northern Rockies. Endangered species were front and center. Sage grouse, prairie dogs, lynx. During this time, we saw the organic movement, organic farming movement thrive in New England with CSAs, as you say. And many of our friends, Elliot Coleman among them, had just written his excellent primer, The New Organic Grower. That was 1995. So these were parallel movements, sometimes combative, but really ultimately supportive. New England in particular and the Northeast generally, and I'm going to say this part of the country were on the side of restoration. Those of us living in the American West were on the side of destruction. So we were fighting for our lives and the wild lives that we live next to, where the academy then enters in and it becomes an abstraction. That's how we saw it. And I can tell you, as an environmental writer in the 1990s, it wasn't very much fun. The academy was catching up with what was happening on the ground. You had powerful environmental historians like Richard White that you suggest, Becky, at Yale. You had William Cronin in Wisconsin. You had Larry Buell here at Harvard and Patty Limerick at the University of Colorado. Their contributions were immense that you talk about, documenting contemporary environmental histories, offering a different story of the American West, and really calling us out on racism and privilege and all the things that you bring up, Becky and Dan. Rightfully so, but all of us were labeled as naive, as draped in nostalgia, and irrelevant. And mainly the environmental writers, at least the perspective I'm talking about, were white male, writing solo narratives. I escaped a little bit of the fire, but not much, because I was female and Mormon that had a communitarian point of view that you refer to in your book. But there were others, Scott Momaday, Leslie Silko, Simon Ortiz, Sandra Cisneros, that were also part of this community. And then we really felt cover from people like Rachel Carson and Silent Spring, and also E.L. Wilson, who came to our defense. Bill Cronin wrote a cutting essay that you referred to called The Problem with Wilderness. It was 1995, it was August, I was at Breadloaf at the literary gathering. I read it and I was heartsick and I was furious because I thought, this is from the Ivory Tower. Why don't you come out and look and see how abstract this is? We had a wilderness bill before Congress. Orrin Hatch, that article appeared in the New York Times Magazine. It had a lot of attention and a lot of power because of Cronin. Orrin Hatch, Republican, hater of wilderness, held that up on the Senate floor and said, see, even the elites, the liberal elites agree with us. I wrote Bill a letter and I just said, I understand what you're saying, but here's how it's being taken. And we had a rigorous, transformative conversation, the two of us, to say the least. I asked him how he could reinvent nature. You drop your pen, it's going to fall to the ground. I don't know how you reinvent ecosystems. I don't know how you reinvent gravity. And then he said to me, how can you talk about wilderness and not have it be accessible to everyone? How can you talk about wilderness and not have Native people included in this? So these were the conversations that we had. He ended up on the Governing Council of the Wilderness Society. I noticed that Reinventing Nature was not the paperback subtitle on Uncommon Ground, and I can tell you that he influenced my work dramatically. I could never have written a book like The Hour of Land had it not been for the 1990s that you really highlight in this. The binary was breaking down. We were forming a community who cared. The Eastern United States and the Western United States joined hands together because we realized what was at stake. What was important was wild nature in our health and in our imagination, and then the biodiversity that was now threatened by something so much larger than any of us, which is climate change and fossil fuel industry. So these are the deeper stories, and this is where I think, Dan, your contribution is so huge, because you bring to us your prophetic voice. Quote, while Anthroposophy's emphasis on spiritual development leads some people to intense identification with the vocation of farming, it inspires others to bring an ecological consciousness to artistic or entrepreneurial vocations. Dan calls for an appropriate anthropocentrism, In other words, we can no longer view ourselves apart from nature, but a part of nature. And I think that's one of your most beautiful contributions. And you invite us to really think about what might a different kind of power look like, feel like, and can we extend this power beyond our own species? In so many ways, Anthroposophy, as I understand it, does address this. And you write eloquently in your last chapter how the earth is simply the vessel for the current phase of the human story. I'm a little bit uncomfortable with the human-centeredness of that, but I understand what you're saying, and I would add to that, is earth not enough? And must we always be the center of our concerns? And can we evolve in this time of the Anthropocene with a language maybe we haven't even found? One that isn't so much anthropocentric, but life-centered. And perhaps that is in what you're talking about, and I'm not understanding it fully. It's the creative tensions of this book that I found so alive. And lastly, I'm going to just close with Rudolf Steiner saying, authentic environmentalism has to go through the individualizing of human consciousness. That's the challenge of our time, he says, to find a way back to each and find new relationship in the earth based on our individuality with the earth. So here's the question I would offer up. With Rudolf Steiner's privileging of experience that you also honor, Dan, how do we bring that and privilege that into our scholarship here in the Academy? To bring blood back into our research so that it moves us, not just mentally, but spiritually. And when we know that the earth of 2100 that we are facing is going to be so vastly different from where we stand now, how can this question of an evolving earth and evolving consciousness be brought to bear right here with the Harvard Divinity School community? How might this be a call for unity at the curriculum here? Because what I think you show us is that this environmental issue is no longer an ecological project or an economic or social project, but a spiritual project, part of Anthroposophy's adaptive evolution. Thank you.
Rich engagement. I really appreciate the way both of you did use the book as a springboard for talking about the big questions that we need to engage as scholars in the environmental humanities and the big questions that we need to engage as inhabitants of this planet at this moment. And I'll just pick up on two things that the two of you brought so as not to take up too much time. And first is this question of the wilderness agriculture polarity? And I think you're absolutely right that that is probably not as polarized now as it was 20 years ago. And I think writing the book, I really struggled to know. Well, one, I struggled to know whether presenting it as a polarizing thing was a straw person or not, and I struggled to know whether I was entitled to be the voice of harmonious balance between these two perspectives, or whether I was in fact a partisan on the agriculture side of the fence who needed to listen deeply to people working in wilderness conservation. And I guess the two things that I want to say now, first, there's a real danger in this conversation of a kind of historical one-upspersonship, because the fact of the matter is there's a deeply racist strand of the origins of organic agriculture, and there's a deeply racist strand of the origins of wilderness preservation. So it's too easy for people on one or the other side of the fence to highlight that because it's thick in both sides, and a lot of the really good work on environmental racism, comes out of communities and conversations that are quite distinct from both of these communities. For me, I think the big moral question, thinking forward, is what does it mean to love the world that I and everybody in this room was born into, which is a radically agriculturalized world? What does it mean to love animals when I believe the majority of large mammals on this planet are humans, cows, pigs, sheep, and goats? What does it mean to love plants when grass and wheat are a large percentage, and rice are a large percentage of the individual plants that we share this earth with? What does it, is there a way to say, yes, there need to be more buffalo, yes, there need to be more wolves, and there may need to be fewer cows, but I can't stop loving cows when I say that there needs to be fewer of them to make room for more buffalo and wolves. And where are the places, where there can be fruitful coexistence between wild nature and agricultural nature? And this is a really important part of biodynamics, that any healthy farm organism has wild inhabitants as well as domesticated inhabitants. So these are just all really live questions, and I just want to invite everybody to think about them together. And then I want to pick up on the disability and environmentalism question, because this is something that I've agreed to talk about this at an event at the Goetheanum, the Spiritual Center of Anthroposophy, in October, and I haven't quite figured out what I have to say yet, because I really, I came at this topic through Camp Hill, but I came to Camp Hill through intentional community rather than through disability studies, and I'm really kind of working on this. But I do think part of it is about neoliberalism and about the ways in which both persons with disabilities and agriculture are otherized and marginalized by a system that wants everything to fit into a market economy. And it's really a struggle when you're being marginalized or otherized to decide whether to try to find your way in to the system that's marginalizing you, or whether to make common cause with all the other things that are marginalized. And maybe I skipped a step there to just say, you can't make a living farming, but we live in a society where that expects everybody to make their own living. And similarly, on all kinds of disabilities, and an ever larger share of the human population is not able to do what the market economy would consider productive work. And so both of these things are otherized by a market economy. But there's a strand of sustainable agriculture that says what we've got to do is figure out how to make this work economically. And this is a really interesting part of the community-supported agriculture movement. The first community-supported farms were set up on a pay what you can, take what you need basis. Most community-supported agriculture farms now there is this set price for this exact box of vegetables, and we're going to compete with the farm down the road for a better price. So there's already this strong pushing this thing, which is intended to be an alternative to the market, back into the market. And more broadly, a lot of organic farmers are asking, how can we make the bottom line work? And similarly, a lot of disability policy is about making it easier for people, regardless of their disabilities, to be productive workers in the mainstream labor force. So Camp Hill, as a movement of alternative communities, where people with and without disabilities are creating a non-market-based life, is in a lot of tension with contemporary disability policy that says being in, heaven forbid, a farming community denies the human rights of the person with disabilities, because farming is by nature outside of real society. And people of all abilities have a right to full access to real society. So you actually have policies on the books that prevent disability housing funding being spent for people living on farms. Camp Hill, Minnesota, which is in the midst of agriculture part of the country, finds this very odd, because a lot of the people living there, grew up on farms anyhow. And I don't want to demonize that policy, because that's responding to a real heritage of institutions that did violate people's human rights, and in many ways Camp Hill does limit the full right of self-determination for some of the people who live there, although they're struggling with it. So these are real struggles. Don't hear me as making this seem simple. But my sense is that somehow, if the sustainable agriculture movement and the disability rights movement can have a more direct conversation about how to build an alternative to the market logic that diminishes their full realities, something really exciting to think about. So I'll leave it there.
Would either of you like to respond, or should we open it up to questions?
Let's just open it up. Let's open it up.
Great.
Who knows what else lies? But I wonder if anyone could lend me their pen. I'm a writer who feels naked without one, and I thank you.
Oh,
Professor McKanan.
yeah.
Thank you all for all of your insights. Professor McKanan, I wonder if you could tell us more about the alchemy parts of the Eco-Alchemy.
Oh, yeah. So, alchemy is a traditional Western, although there's also non-Western forms of alchemy, scientific approach that thinks a lot in terms of balancing polarities. And a lot of what I talk about in terms of the ideological roots of anthroposophy is that Steiner was trying to preserve the wisdom of historic traditions that have been marginalized in the modern world, but in a way that's relevant to the modern world. So one of the polarities he's trying to balance is the very polarity between ancient tradition and modernity. And so alchemy was a tradition that he had great respect for. A lot of the stuff that's in biodynamics that's not in mainstream organics is alchemical in nature. But I chose the Eco-Alchemy title. One, I wanted to use magic in the title. Everybody that I've spoken to who's part of the anthroposophical movement agrees that the way I define magic, anthroposophy fits into that, but the way many people out there in the rest of the world define magic, anthroposophy does not fit. So I realized that I would be inauthentic to use magic as a framework. But alchemy does something similar to what magic does for me, which is to talk about the way one brings one's full subjectivity into one's engagement with the natural world. So that was one reason I chose alchemy. But the other reason was to make this broader point that the balancing of polarities, East-West, tradition, modern, socialism, capitalism, is something that anthroposophy again and again brings to the environmental movement, even as it can sometimes be perceived as a fringy extreme version of environmentalism. What it's actually doing is a balancing of polarities that's in that alchemical stream. Yeah.
Struggling to get this word out, but the contrast you were drawing earlier was preservationist, this New England version of that, both which are white, sort of wealthy ideas. I'd like to hear more about how you would respond to the prompt of, in the context of homogeny, why is there such a value placed on difference? And does that model itself after what like resource constraints poverty already does to other communities? And is that a driving factor?
Yeah. So you're identifying the paradox that both an organic agriculture movement that is somewhat Eurocentric in its roots, and a wilderness preservation movement that is somewhat Eurocentric in its roots, celebrate difference. And so are you asking why that celebration of difference did not more quickly lead to robust alliances with anti-racist struggles?
That, or is there some kind of inherent value seen in difference?
Or yeah, or is the other, or
Either way.
or is it that is there something bourgeois about celebrating difference as a thing in itself?
How would you respond?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think this is one we could maybe all take in different directions.
I mean, one thing that comes to me is just, if you look at ecological thought and practice, diversity equals stability within the natural world. So there is that physical component that diverse landscapes are healthier landscapes than monoculture, like a cornfield or a wheat field, for that matter. And I think that you're seeing that diversity in organic farming too, and how you rotate crops and those kinds of things. So there's that. But I would also add to that just this notion of the glorious indifference of wild places. That in a sense it is an evolutionary stance of what gets privileged or favored. I'm just looking at the earth, but take us out of it for a moment, which may be a conservationist point of view. But there is that, where I think the land, it could be argued, cares nothing for us. But I wonder, in your philosophy, does it?
Yeah. And I'm not quite sure where my philosophy fits into this, because sometimes I'm channeling an anthroposophical view when my actual views are a little bit more Gaian than that, but not all the way
What
over.
would Steiner say?
Yeah.
Is the earth indifferent, or does it respond to us? Does it have its own intelligences? And I'm conflicted too.
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing, and I think I would agree with this, is that the world has always been in relationship with us as humans, and so the relationship is primordial. Well, at least as long as there've been humans on the earth. That's maybe where I would disagree with Steiner. But just because, I mean, all species are symbiotic with one another to varying degrees, right? So the idea that any species could be radically indifferent seems incorrect, although there's different levels of consciousness of that. I mean, I think the question about diversity as an intrinsic value is really, I mean, it is something. It's something that feels very rock solid to me. Of course, the more biodiversity we have, the better. And our friends at Monsanto would say, hey, here are 200 strains of rice. These two are twice as productive as the other 198. Who's going to die if we insist on planting all 200? I think that's a wrong way of thinking, but I would be very presumptuous to say that I am certain it's a wrong way of thinking, or that I can fully unpack why it's a wrong way of thinking. And that, I think, is why it's so terribly important for groups like the Brazilian landless workers movement and other agroecological movements in the global south, rooted in the experiences of people who do face actual threats of starvation, to be fully at the table whenever we're talking, especially when we're talking about actually scaling up organic practices beyond the 1% of global production it is now.
I just want to respond to your comment in a different way, or related, but moving in another direction. I think some of what you're getting at is, and I'm thinking of the wonderful call that Terry just gave us about getting blood back into academia, and as someone who's always struggled with academia, I think we do need more blood in it. And I think part of what you might be getting at is that academia is playing this catch-up of like, oh my gosh, we have to look at where all the biases were and who was left out of the conversation and so on. And I think there is that danger that you're getting out of sort of naming something but not really addressing it. Sort of saying, here's who gets left out, here are the problems with that, and then it just becomes self-perpetuating, but the actual on the ground sort of playing out the realities of the problems doesn't necessarily get done. Another part I would add is in terms of diversity, in terms of the parallel of what Terry was talking about, of natural diversity and how nature moves in that direction, thrives with diversity. I think there is a mirroring of natural diversity and cultural diversity. I think that's where you were going. Yeah. And then it cycles back because cultural diversity gives us different kinds of scientific knowledge that Western science hasn't always put out there. And I'm thinking of the work of Robin Kimmerer as someone who talks about indigenous knowledge, and she's bringing together familiar Western science knowledge of plants and ecosystems, and then saying, and here are the knowledges that come from my native culture, native identity. Here's how they work together. Here's what gets left out. And so her work is a good example of sort of saying, we're not giving lip service to difference. Here are the different kinds of knowledges that come into the conversation if difference is not just named, but really kind of dealt with on the ground. So I really appreciate that.
I think it's such a brilliant question. The other side of that is, I think the polarity has been lessened with this conversation, in environmentalism because of the diversity of partners. So that in a place, you look at what happened at Standing Rock and all the different allies that were standing with the Lakota, or if you look at Bear Sears, all the different allies, including farmers and ranchers, that are now, there's a wonderful two women in Boulder, Utah, where every year it's 22,000 pounds of vegetables that are made in the that are farmed in the community, and they had a huge voice as businesswomen in Grand Staircase Escalante of the economics. And I'll never forget, Blake Spalding said, economics and ecology have the same root, ecos. We want these protected lands. And she was right alongside the Navajo, right alongside the Mormon ranchers. So I think diversity has, rather than trickle down economics, it's a trickle up from the ground itself that has influenced a cultural diversity, even in this debate we're talking about.
There's a statement that about that agricultural people on the land are outside of society. This was in the context of camping. And I think that what really needs to be done, I believe, something that I'm trying to do, is to rethink our category of agriculture. our category of agriculture is profoundly Eurocentric, and it is tied to what's happened in the beginning of agriculture, in the Fertile Crescent. And it's totally inseparable from the notion of domestication and separation. You build a boundary between what is domesticated and what is wild. Now, I am working in the Upper Amazon with indigenous people, and through that work, that collaboration, I have learned that I have become aware of my own Eurocentric assumptions. That assumption absolutely does not exist. The powers that be, that are totally Eurocentric, the state, the international, go on that, and they, pardon my French, they screw the indigenous people terribly, because all the laws, everything is based on this notion of what is agriculture, and it just doesn't exist. So even the term agroforestry doesn't begin to really get at that other reality, where the forest in our part, the part where my center is the dominant reality, the rainforest. It's the high Amazon. The forest is, the way they speak of it, our home, our market, our sacred place, everything. And it's full of spirits. And the spirits are spoken of as in kin terminology. So we humans are part of a wider network, and so that the fact that there are parts that are more intensively interacted with by humans and parts much less, that is of course recognized. Of course. Whether it's plants or animals, that is all recognized. But there is no place that we are outside of. None. We are part of it. And for me, I've been, involved in that place for over 2 decades. And it's a very slow learning and slow transformation, because these categories are so deeply rooted in us, and their implications are millions. And I'm discovering little by little when I think, oh yes, I've got to know. No, I haven't. You've got to go deeper and deeper and deeper. And I think that if we were stuck with that notion of agriculture as separate from something else, we could not end up with the notion of, if you're a farmer, you're out of it. You just couldn't. The given is that we are part of, we're kin of, and we are immersed in, and we're in reciprocity with the non-human and with the human, and the animals and the plants and the water and the cosmos and everything. So I found that the closest thing to that is anthroposophy, is biodynamic, that I have seen in the West. But there's still, especially listening to you, but I haven't read your book yet, I just got it, that notion of agriculture. And that needs to be deconstructed, and deeply so.
Yeah, when you're talking about indigenous American traditions that don't draw this boundary between the cultivated and the wild, I immediately thought of, this phrase we have, wild rice, which refers to a crop traditionally cultivated by the Anishinaabe and other indigenous communities, that in a way that doesn't involve this separation of domesticated from wild land. I think, one way to describe the biodynamic project is that it's a project that working from a place that is profoundly Western, in certain senses Eurocentric, towards that understanding of nature that does not separate the wild from the cultivated. So, so this idea of a farm organism that you do need to have a certain amount of wild space to have your farm certified biodynamic, whereas you wouldn't need to have that to have it certified organic. But even that is just a way station, because you would be wanting to move towards a place where to say, this is the part of my farm that's wild and this is the part of my farm that's not, is no longer even necessary. And this, you mentioned Wes Jackson, whose work has been a lot about developing perennial grain crops that don't require the same kind of invasive cultivation to be grown. And that's another project that is moving towards breaking down this binary. Linda, you had your hand. Oh, did you?
I just wanted to also throw in, we haven't talked about urban landscapes, and,
Yeah.
and with all the migration from rural into the cities, I think that's another component that can be ignored.
My point was almost similar. I was going to just point out the elemental beings and the relationship with the moon and all of this, how they're everywhere. They're in both cultivated lands and wild lands, so that's a wholeness that we share. And then also in terms of the Camp Hill Village, the commitment to wholeness there also, and not like as a separation, but a commitment to wholeness in the person's path.
Yeah, and just to keep everybody on the same page, so elemental beings are not exactly spiritual, but beings that are connected to the elements of earth, water, fire, and air in anthroposophical understanding, but of course this is a big place of cross-cultural connection. Robbie?
Oh, I was intrigued by what you were saying about, like, what does it mean to, like, connect with nature? With the, what we were talking about with, and since there's so much of living things now, cows and humans, and how do we connect, how do we, like, truly love nature now? And naturally, the people who come to mind are the Native Americans, and it's interesting when you think about that with the wilderness versus agricultural aspect of it, and what would their opinion, I mean, and since the culture of this is so, and since the people who are leading this are, a lot of them, white males, and they don't have as big of a, presence in it.
Yeah.
What is their, in this debate, the agriculture versus wilderness, naturally, what comes to mind for me would be that they would be more tended toward preserving the wilderness, and obviously they're interchangeable, but what would your opinion be, and what would Stein's opinion be on this?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously very difficult for me to speak in any kind of authoritative way on behalf of indigenous communities, but I think a lot of what we've just been talking about is the ways in which the very distinction between wilderness and civilization is a Western thing that people coming out of Western cultures may need to unlearn, and there are resources for that unlearning within Western cultures, and there are resources that you can get through cross-cultural dialogue. And I will say, I think this is a pretty recent thing, but there's a lot of just as, both of you talking about in other aspects of the environmental movement, the conversation with Native communities is much stronger today than a few decades ago. That's certainly true at biodynamic conferences.
I would also add that some of what we've been talking about in terms of wilderness and agriculture, or as academics do, so I'll take the blame, we sometimes overly draw distinctions in order to sort of clarify, here's something that's not been attended to, this is how it needs to be attended to, et cetera, et cetera. And what I loved about it, we just sort of randomly decided what order to go in without knowing at all what each of us had written. But, so I'm laying down out this academic argument, and then Terry very wisely is saying, and this is what happens, this is the uses, the very tragic uses to which academic distinctions like this can be put. So, is it Robbie?
Yes.
So when you're asking this question, it's good to remember, I love that you piped up and asked it, that these are categories that I think are blurring, that Terry talked about are really much more in conversation with each other than they were. But it's our job to be aware of the categories, aware of where they blur and overlap, to try to make the conversation more human. So beyond the other really important point you made about indigenous cultures, would be just my point of kind of thinking about that it's much more complex always than the way that we academics like to put things in categories.
Quickly, as a writer, I like metaphors, and I think to think about mosaics as a useful metaphor, that whether it's a farm, whether it's wildness, whether it's a city, that we are now seeing things as a mosaic, and that's also an ecological term in terms of fire ecology. And I think when E.O. Wilson says in his latest book, 50% of the earth must be in a sustainable use of land, whether it's wildness, whether it's farms, whether it's national parks, in order for us to survive as a species alongside other species. So I think that's really interesting to think about. What does that mosaic look like, and how can we embody that metaphor on the ground?
If I could just pick up on that point, the 50% thing is something I really struggle with. Why can't we talk about it in terms of 100%?
I'm down on that. But E.O. Wilson, I think he's already, people are already critiquing him as that's too much.
Right.
But I would agree with you in the same way that the Harvard Forest was saying for the 2060 vision, they only allotted 10% of wildlands. And it's like, what? But politically, you just can't say more than that because of all of the issues Becky's brought up in terms of inclusivity and so on and so forth, and economics. So I think we're being timid.
And I guess I would say, I do think that there probably, I am enough on the wilderness side that I do think there should be a number, a percentage of the Earth's surface that human beings figure out a way not to engage with. But my worry is that when we frame it in those kinds of ways, that we let ourselves off the hook from our responsibility to make the places that we inhabit most fully, to make Manhattan a really friendly place for biodiversity.
And maybe that's where the spirituality comes to play, that these become sacred places redefined.
Okay, maybe one more question.
Okay. You said.
I know all three of you have worked with Thoreau. Terry, I saw your talk in Concord this summer, and you've written on Steiger and 19th century Americanism. So much of what you have spoke to today, from difference to economic elitism to theories of Harvard students and putting that into practice, seems really condensed in the Beanfield chapter. So the actual chapter where Thoreau is, in an almost spiritual way, massaging the earth. And he really has put his outside the economic mainstream. The people going by on the road are just metonyms. They're the hat their address, and they say things, what is he doing? This man must be crazy. One man says, corn for fodder, you must plant corn because that's economic. And so my question is that there's been so much said about elitism and the white male perspective, and Western. And the thing is this Thoreau section really brings to a point much of the problems and the difficulties you guys have said. And so what I'm talking about, is there some type of model we could draw from, say, literary practices, from a creative space? Terry, you asked, well, how do we implement this? And so that's just the question. Can we draw anything new from this ecological approach that can actually be moved from theory and kind of be implemented? Because Thoreau tried to do that, and he still gets criticized for it. I mean, he's out there hoeing his bean field, and he says, oh, I made $19 after 3 months. And that's like, well, the usual salary, I think, was like about a day. And so have we, I guess I'll just stop here. Are we still bound by his problem and his definition, or have we escaped that kind of varied legacy?
You know, the biggest thing that I took away from the Thoreau Bicentennial last year was really letting it sink into me how interesting it is that just a few years after the railroad had come through, Thoreau decided the place he was going to engage wilderness was right next to the railroad, where people who had helped build it still had their kind of shanty town. So though he is often used as a pawn in these kind of unhelpful debates, he just completely blew through the whole notion that wilderness is someplace far away from civilization, and said, you know what, you can engage the diversity, every kind of diversity of the world that we've inherited, right where you are, with some intentionality. And I think that's the challenge for us.
I just gave a talk just a few days ago on Thoreau and race, and in many ways I was defending Thoreau. But I think what Dan just said is perfect, because Thoreau did bring these together and made arguments about staying in place that I think, and he very clearly made arguments that said, no, people shouldn't be imitating me, they shouldn't be building cabins by ponds, they should imitate the spirit of what I'm talking about. I don't want them imitating what I'm doing. And I think that goes right back to what Terry said a few minutes ago about the urban, which we haven't really discussed here for plenty of good reasons. I mean, that's not what you're looking at in your book, and that's our starting point. But I think there's something to be said there that Thoreau can help us think about, well, what does it mean to stand in an urban place with all the cultural and natural diversity that exist and flourish in urban places, and be right there amidst wildness, and also possibly, in fact, on plenty of rooftops and in plenty of lots of agriculture. So I certainly do not want to throw Thoreau out because he's a white male of the 19th century. I think he has a great deal to offer us, and certainly there are things Steiner said that made me really uncomfortable, in some of the fascist stuff especially. But there's, I think, what you've done in your book, Dan, is really, I just want to close by saying that I think that what your book really offers in terms of the alchemy is you're very alchemical in the way that you address everything in the book, where you're not overly a champion of Steiner. You're critical, but you show the legacy of anthroposophy and what it can offer, and you're clear that you're not an anthroposophist, that you're a Unitarian Universalist. Here's where you stand, that here's what you've learned from this school of thought that you've really been living, as we all do when we write books. And so I think that you've brought so much to us as a result of the work that you've done.
Well, let's all thank Dan, Rebecca, and Terry.